In accordance with the tradition of this university, we start this ceremony with a short prayer. Spiritus Sancti Gratia illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Sit down. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this academic ceremony. A special welcome to Professor Maghasin from the State Islamic University of Yogyakarta. Very welcome. And also welcome to the members of the Indonesian community in the Netherlands. During this academic ceremony, Handi Hadiwitanto will defend his doctoral thesis on religion and general trust in Indonesia. As we live in a world full of distrust, I think this is a timely topic. And I wish the candidate good luck in his defense. And I now give the floor to you to present your thesis.
With the permission of the Council of Deans and in order to obtain the degree of Doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled Religion and Generalized Trust, an empirical theological study among university students in Indonesia. Since Indonesia's birth as an independent state on 17 August 1945, many conflicts have erupted revolving around ethnicity and religion. At the beginning of the 21st century, conflict erupted within the Muslim community itself in Indonesia, revolving around differences in practice and belief between the majority Sunni Muslims on the one hand and the minority Muslim groups of Ahmadiyya and Shia on the other. There also have been numerous cases of religious tension between the Muslim majority and the Christian minority, expressed through acts of terrorism in places of worship and the refusal to allow the establishment of churches in several places. Against this background, we ask the question, do religions in Indonesia fail to encourage trust between people with different ethnic and religious backgrounds? In order to find an answer to this question, we formulate three theoretical presumptions. First, we presume that religion is not the only source of distrust between people, but also the source of trust. Therefore, we need to understand the religious beliefs which induce distrust or trust. We distinguish religious intragroup beliefs and intergroup beliefs. Second, religious intragroup beliefs are core elements of faith within a particular tradition. We included the following beliefs: religious beliefs about God, Muhammad or Jesus, the interpretation of Holy Scriptures and faith, and the understanding of the Quran or the Bible. Religious intragroup beliefs can be exclusive or inclusive. Exclusive convictions are likely to induce negative attitudes toward believers or other religions, while inclusive convictions are likely to contribute to trust. Third, religious intergroup beliefs are religious convictions that relate directly or indirectly to intergroup relations. We distinguish attitudes towards religious plurality, religiocentrism, attitudes towards religion-state relationship, and religious vocation about solidarity and justice. Conceptually, religious intergroup beliefs play an important role in behavior and actions towards other religious groups, and it means that religious intergroup beliefs can reduce or induce trust. We started to build our notion of trust from the sociological theory of Uslaner, Putnam, Seligman, and others. Trust is an important component in actively and constructively facing the future of living together in a modern and diverse society. Trust enables individuals and groups to handle the complexity of social relationships and contributes to the avoidance of social conflicts. In this research, we focus on generalized trust, which is a form of social trust that reaches out to dissimilar others in specific circumstances. And that is based on both experience of the past and the idea of a shared moral community. In a modern and plural society as Indonesia, relations between people who do not know each other personally are unavoidable. Generalized trust is therefore a very relevant issue. We presume that religion in Indonesia plays an important role in both the private and public spheres. In distinction with sociological theory, we understand trust as part of the belief system of religious people in Indonesia. We define religiously inspired generalized trust as a religious attitude towards people outside one's own religious community. Further, presuppose that generalized trust is always contextual, namely related to specific persons and groups in specific conditions. Hence, we operationalize the concept of religiously inspired generalized trust in specific societal domains, namely economic, political, social, and cultural domain. The research question of our research is the following. To what extent do Muslims and Christian students recognize and agree with religiously inspired generalized trust related to specific domains in Indonesia? To what extent religious intra-group and intergroup beliefs influence religiously inspired generalized trust? To answer this research question, we used a survey distributed among university students in 2 locations in Indonesia, Ambon and Yogyakarta. We selected 3 categories of universities or institutes: state universities, Islamic university, and Christian university. We had 1,499 respondents who are Muslim and Christian university students. This is our conceptual model. On the right, you see the dependent variable, religiously inspired generalized trust related to specific domains in Indonesia. In order to answer our first research question, we use factor analysis to construct scales of generalized trust related to specific domains for both Muslim and Christian students. On the left side, you see the independent variables, background variables, and intra-group beliefs. And in the middle, you see the intermediary variables, which are the intergroup attitudes. We used 2 types of statistical analysis to answer the second research question, bivariate analysis and regression analysis. The last analysis is used to examine to what extent the dependent variable, which is religiously inspired generalized trust in specific domain, is explained by the influence of independent variables, background characteristic, and religious intragroup beliefs, and intermediary variables, which is religious intergroup beliefs. In all instances, we made cross-religious comparison between our Muslim and Christian respondents. In our research, we found 2 comparative types of religiously inspired generalized trust among Muslim and Christian students in Indonesia: socio-cultural trust and tolerating hedonism. We also found 2 types of religiously inspired generalized trust that are exclusive for each group. For Muslims, we found economic trust and political trust. Among Christians, we found another 2 types of religiously inspired generalized trust, namely fair salary system and economic political trust. In this presentation, we would like to show you one example of the result of regression analysis, namely socio-cultural trust among Muslims and Christian students. Socio-cultural trust contains the idea that religious community supports access to adequate education for all people, as well as respect for everyone, regardless of differences in religious background. Muslim and Christian students agree that their own religious community should support and contribute to equal educational access for everybody and respect all people and religions. On the slide, you see the result of the regression analysis. In the left column, we distinguish location, intra-group beliefs, and intergroup beliefs. In the second column, you see the results for Muslim students. In the right column, you see the results of the Christian students. The number of plus signs in the columns indicate the strength of a variable in predictions the level of agreement with socio-cultural trust. For both group Muslim and Christian students, religious intergroup beliefs are stronger predictors for socio-cultural trust than religious intra-group beliefs. Among intergroup beliefs, the most important predictor of socio-cultural trust is religious vocation for solidarity and justice. The vocation implies a positive orientation towards all people in society who are in need of help and who need to be treated fairly based on their rights. Next to the vocation for solidarity and justice, another set of intergroup beliefs induce socio-cultural trust, namely the cooperation model of the religion-state relationship. In cooperation model, the state should actively facilitate and support different religious groups. We also found that positive in-group attitudes influence socio-cultural trust among Christians. In the specific context of Christians as minority group, a positive self-concept supports a higher level of agreement of socio-cultural trust. Socio-cultural trust for both groups is also influenced by several intra-group beliefs, notably religious images of Muhammad for Muslims and Jesus for Christians, and models for interpreting Holy Scriptures and faith and the concept of Holy Scriptures. Finally, Yogyakarta, also the location, also affects socio-cultural trust among Muslims and Christians. Both Muslims and Christian students in Yogyakarta, which never had a serious religious conflict, support socio-cultural trust as a religiously inspired generalized trust more than those in Ambon. In this sense, location as a predictor here explains generalized trust more from the history of conflict perspective. What has our research contributed to the development of theological theory? Religiously inspired generalized trust among Muslims and Christian students in Indonesia reflects the process of doing theology in the specific contextual experience of each religious group. As we were able to show in our research, even the concept of generalized trust are specific for different groups according to their group experience in the context of different regions in Indonesia. The process of doing theology in daily life gives meaning to life experience. In this sense, the validity of religious tradition and revelation can be found in concrete experience. Theology has a responsibility to develop its internal language in accordance with this daily experience in order to be able to communicate theological concept in connection with human experience. We think that our research opens a new understanding that what I like to call a practical public theology. Practical public theology is an opening up to experiences in correlation with religious traditions, so that concrete experiences in the light of faith can inform theological ideas. Through these experiences, people connect their religious beliefs with their concrete life in society. According to our research, we conclude that generalized trust is a theological idea when religious believers are doing public theology. From the perspective of a practical public theology, religiously inspired generalized trust reflects theological responses to the experience of plurality and of threats to humanity, such as disintegration, discrimination, poverty, etc. Generalized trust in which religious believers are paying attention to and are open to human experience becomes a creative transformation to broaden inclusiveness in society. Religiously inspired generalized trust here is one of the products of public theology that binds lives together and creates inclusive human communities wherein both Christian and Muslim believers strive together for the dawn of full humanity. According to our research, we can understand generalized trust not just as a socio-ethical concept, but as a religiously inspired idea in the religious meaning system of the believer in which theological understanding and beliefs inform a specific way of living with others in the public domain. Having presented the summary of my doctoral thesis, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Professor Mahasin.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you, Handi. I remember that one decade, I mean, in the end of 2005 or in the beginning of 2006, I was invited here by Carl and Chris to talk about the plan of your dissertation. And now, after 10 years, you finish eventually your dissertation. So congratulations for this. And I want to raise a question. It is not based on your dissertation, but it is more a reflection on what you have written in your dissertation. Our Prophet Muhammad was quoted as saying that anyone cannot be a true believer until his neighbor is safe from him any harm. This is the first quotation. A second quotation, in the opposite, while in the case of lifting sanctions against Iran, President Obama said that Iran deal is not built on trust, but it is built on verification. So my question is, what do you think about these two opposite things. That one, we can use trust or we can use verification in order to live together peacefully. Okay.
Honored sir, thank you for your question. I would like to explain or to react on this question from the theoretical perspective. That's the first thing. From the theoretical perspective, we have several types of trust, actually. So there is one is personal trust, and the second is the social trust. Personal trust is about trust between people who knows each other well. So, for instance, for example, this is about family. So we can trust of course not our wife, we can trust my wife, for instance, or my wife trusts me, or I trust my children. That's a kind of personal trust. We also can get it in the most abstract, but still in the personal trust. For instance, in the office, or in the factory or shops, we have to trust somebody there, yeah, to make a connection, make a communication. That's a kind of personal trust. In this type of trust, we really need a kind of experience, knowledge, because we have to know each other. That's personal trust. Social trust is in the level and in the more abstract level. So we talk about society, we talk about people. Not every people can know each others. So in the social abstract, we really talk about, or we think about the situation in society. That's social trust. But in social trust, according to Uslaner, from the theoretical perspective, there's also two types: particularized trust and generalized trust. Particularized trust is about trust in society, is so in the abstract level, but still have to they need to have a kind of knowledge or experience, particular experience. So in this kind of trust in society, but there is a kind of MOU, for instance, memorandum of understanding. There is an understanding. There is a agreement. That's a kind of trust in particularized trust. But if we go to more abstract, that's what we call generalized trust. In generalized trust, we don't know anything. But in generalized trust, we try to have a trust to others who do not know, based on kind of principles, kind of moral principles. That's what trust from the theoretical perspective. So in this, back to the questions is, if we talk about relation between countries, among countries like America and Iran, something like that, this is I do agree that this is in the society, so we can talk about social trust here, but the relation between one country and another, this is the relation is not really like what we call it in generalized trust, because this is in the relation between countries, they do need an agreement and some idea how to make a connection between them, among them. So I think if I back to your questions, this is what we have to think, that people in countries, among countries, have to make a good communication among them and make a kind of a memorandum, something like that, because they have to encourage trust among them, but in the perspective of social trust, but in particularized trust.
May I interrupt?
Yes.
So like when you send your children to school, for example,
yeah,
you can say that you trust the school, that the school will give a good education for your student. But you can have also another reason, is that because there is a regulation, if the school does not comply with this regulation, it will get sanctioned. So it is not only trust, but also regulation and verification, regulation and control of it. So we build our relation by not by basing our relationship between us on trust, but on the fact that we can control each other. I mean that you may not betray me, because if you betray, you will get sanctioned from the society or from the government.
Yeah, thank you.
Short answer, please.
Short answer.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I do agree with that. And that kind of situation, communication, that's not a generalized trust, but particularized trust. Because in particularized trust, we really do need a kind of knowledge and agreement with that. So I agree that in that situation, of course, we cannot avoid everything. Only trust, okay, that's not clear. But trust is still there. Yeah, but there are two types of that trust. But that I agree.
Thank you. You can continue the discussion during the reception. I now give the floor to Dr. Vermeer.
Okay, dear Handi, finally, after all these years, you now come to defend your PhD thesis. Thesis which reflects an interesting piece of work, I think, into the negative but also positive effects of religion on trust between different religious groups in Indonesia. This makes your PhD thesis of interest not only to the academic community, but also to religious leaders, policymakers and politicians. This is a remarkable achievement for which I would like to congratulate you wholeheartedly. But of course your study also raises some questions, that's why I'm here. And here is my first question to you. My first question regards the dependent variable of your study, religiously inspired generalized trust. So in that case, it follows logically the first question. So having read your entire thesis, it is still not clear to me what you mean by religiously inspired generalized trust. In section 1.1.1, you discuss perceived threats in different societal domains in Indonesia, like the lack of job opportunities in the economic domain, and in section 4.3.3, you try to explain what religiously inspired generalized trust could mean in these societal domains. However, it remains unclear to me what section 4.3.3 adds to what has already been said in section 1.1.1. To give you an example related to the economic domain again, on page 164 you conclude, and I quote, "Economic deprivation in combination with religious categorization is fertile ground for distrust between groups. Within the economic domain, religiously inspired generalized trust can take the form of supporting equal job opportunities and fair salaries for everyone, independent of religious belonging. But why is this an instance of generalized trust? I don't get this. And more important, why is this an instance of religiously inspired generalized trust? What does religiously inspired exactly mean in this respect? What is, for instance, the difference between an atheist supporting equal job opportunities and a Christian or Muslim doing this? Is the only difference here that this striving for social equality is supported by a religious or a non-religious person? Or is there more to it than this? For me, this remains very unclear. And therefore, my question is, could you explain in a few words what religiously inspired generalized trust exactly is?
Honored, sir. Thank you for the question. I'm trying to explain in few words.
Please.
Maybe I would like to start with the context of Indonesia. Religion is very salient in Indonesia. Yeah, of course, religion is also still important here in for people here in the Western society. But in Indonesia, in Asia, maybe I have to say more bigger. In Asia, religion is very salient. People always think sometimes through religious perspectives about everything. They make a connection. If they think about one thing, then sometimes they go through from the religious perspectives. Yeah, they make a connection within that. For example, in Indonesia, in my area, Yogyakarta, that's also the area of this research. When there is mountains erupted, then they always think that what God wants to do, what we should do, because maybe this is a sign from God, something like that. That's still strong in Indonesian context. So when we think about this idea of generalized trust, because generalized trust basically is the idea of sociology, yeah, about society. In modern society, we really need trust because so many people, different people, live together. And also in Indonesia, that's also the context that's very important to how to deal with differentiations. And so then generalized trust is relevant in that. But then we think that this is not only about a social idea, but we have to examine to what extent this idea, sociological idea, but in the perspective also in religious people. So why we try to put this concept with religiously inspired generalized trust. In the operationalization, we can see clearer, I think, because in the operationalization, we put phrase, our community or our religious community should support, for instance, the idea of trust in specific domain. Then in this situation, so we measure this the condition how far people, religious people in Indonesia, deal with the idea of trust in specific domain. When we continue the research, when we try to measure the influence of intra-group beliefs, intergroup beliefs, this is makes stronger the idea of how far the idea of religiously inspired generalized trust can recognized by people there. Yeah? Whether the religious inspired generalized trust is induced by a specific idea of theology or not, or in the intra-group or in the intergroup. That's the idea of this research. So why we put the title of this research is religiously inspired generalized trust in the dependent variable religiously inspired.
So are you saying that in the specific context of Indonesia there is no generalized trust independent of religion? It's part of religion.
I do not want to say that. I believe that generalized trust is also available there in the society without religion, but that's not the case in this dissertation. The case is we want to see how religious people think. So why
that's if you want to see how religious people think, why not measure generalized trust and see which religious attitudes influence generalized trust? But you call the dependent variable already religiously inspired generalized trust, and that was what confuses me, so to say. But on the other hand, if the first part of your answer, yeah, I can understand, but that suggests that if you talk about trust in the context of Indonesia, you hardly can't do that without a religious framework.
Maybe we move to the next question and we can come back to this question.
Also during the reception.
Yeah. Good. I now give the floor to Professor van der Velde.
Thank you. Dear Handi, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you with your thesis, and also I'd like to thank you for the last answer which you gave to Dr. Vermeer, because this partly touches to my question. If it comes to trust in Southeast Asia, and the question which I'm going to raise to you is larger than only Indonesia, because I traveled a lot in the region to all countries out there, also the mainland Southeast Asia. My question concerns the following. You talk about generalized trust, about trust, and you just mentioned things like eruptions of volcanoes and earthquakes, etc., these kind of things. And when the religions of Southeast Asia were mapped, were framed, I think actually one was left out. And that's a very important one. It's divine kingship concerning the Raja, the cult of the Raja. We find this in Myanmar, you find it in Laos. It was there in Myanmar, it was there in Laos. It's still there in Thailand. It's there in Cambodia. King Sihamuni is one of the gods, actually. And you mention, of course, the royal house of Yogyakarta. The Sultan of Yogyakarta, for a very long time, also had this position, divine kingship. And I would like to know your opinion on this. Isn't, in a way, the fact that divine kingship, the cult concerning the Raja, was never institutionalized or seen as a world religion or local religion, isn't that one of the missing elements now if we analyze the situation of Indonesia? What do you think?
Sir, thank you for the questions. Yes, I can agree with you that in Yogyakarta, especially, the kingship, culture of kingship is still there. Maybe if I put this this element to measure the idea of generalized trust, maybe it can fruitful if we talk about only about the political trust, for instance, about how citizens trust government, for instance, and then in that specific situation. So if we try to make a research, examine the situation, how the relation between citizen and king in the area, it will be fruitful. But yes, I have to say that I do not put that kind of element as a variable in my research. But in the interpretation of data, I still do the context always to see how to interpret the situations. For instance, there is a result in my research about the socio-cultural trust, for instance, in Yogyakarta, and then we can see that the predictors of socio-cultural trust is about cooperation model, religion-state relationship. We call cooperation. So there's a cooperation between state and religions. Then the fact that whether the government there or king, even in Yogyakarta, support or not support, can influence this situation. Yeah, when my respondents say that they really want to have a cooperation model to induce trust, so we cannot avoid the idea of context, and so it depends on the context of specific area. If in that area, then the government or the king or everybody who have a rule in that area do not support the idea of cooperation, that it will be problem for trust. In some areas in Indonesia, there is a kind of that kind problem. In some areas, there's a government who sometimes who really not who do not want to support the idea of cooperation, because maybe they prefer to stand aside to one side. Yeah, for instance, for the majority group or for specific group, for instance, then the problem of trust can be raised here.
Okay,
That's my answer.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Van Bruggs.
Dear candidate, congratulations with your great book on religion and generalized trust. shows that you have worked very hard on it, and you are fully entitled to be very proud of this study. I read it with fascination and admiration. I hope you trust me to ask a question about your study, be it socio-cultural trust, personal trust, or tolerating hedonism, probably the latter, as I raised the question in my role as the devil's advocate. You relate on page 16 that you found, I quote, Christian students surprisingly feeling less oppressed and discriminated against than Muslim students. This is a remarkable finding because as a religious minority, Christians are anything but favored by the Indonesian government, unquote. I agree, this is remarkable. I must admit that I do not fully trust this answer. You say it may indicate that perceived threat is lower nowadays than it was before. I would like to invite you to reflect further on your remarkable finding. Might it be that Christian students belonging to a threatened minority gave the answers that they thought that authorities and the dominating majority would like to hear? In other words, that they gave socially desirable answers with regard to this sensitive topic, or answers inspired by their religious faith. According to Clifford Geertz, religion offers both a model of the world as it is, and a model for the world as it ought to be. Was it the latter, as it ought to be? Furthermore, what people say they do is not always what they really do. So do Christian students really feel less oppressed and discriminated against than Muslim students? I'd like to invite you to reflect a little bit further on that.
No, sir. Thank you for the questions and remarks on this finding. This is the result of when I try to measure the agreement of students about the context. And in the context of political domains, this is interesting because Christians as a minority think that they less oppressed than the majority. But I interpret this result as my respondents are students, university students, and there is a different experience if we compare with adults or with people who have adults, where maybe they have had more oppressed situations in Indonesia as a Christian group, or because they deal with many things in their daily life. So maybe the result will be different if I measure this kind of tools to the adults. But it is interesting because for my respondents, university students, they have a kind of or what do you say in English? Optimistic perspective to see the situation. And of course, there are some different results, for the context. But for political context in that in my tools, this is about unfair use power. They think that the situation is not that bad. So they try to show the optimistic perspective to answer this specific context. But I agree with you. This cannot say everything. This is so specific, only for unfair use power. We have to measure with different types of scales. Like for instance, maybe discrimination or bullying, now something like that. So maybe we can find more variance of the results. That's my question.
Thank
my
you very
answer.
much.
I now give the floor to Dr. Sherarad.
Ja, geachte promovendus, dear candidate, dear Handi, congratulations with your clearly structured thesis. And I like to read your work, and of course I also have a question about the empirical study of the operationalization of the images of God. In your study about the modern pluralistic world, you check only the influence of the anthropomorphic image of God. The result, it almost does not matter. Are you sure that this key issue has been explored adequately? If so, why?
Honored sir, thank you for the questions. Yes, this is interesting about image of God. So in chapter 2, we can see that I try to make a scales based on work of Professor Hans van der Vens and Dave Kapukau as well, and then try to make modifications and try to see not only anthropomorphic God and non-anthropomorphic God, but almost the whole scales about everything, panentheism, deism. But then the result is my respondents cannot recognize that anything about that scales. The result of factor analysis comes only two types, anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic. For Indonesian people, they can recognize directly about that. Anthropomorphic, God with everything, with personalizations, or with the icon and everything, and non-anthropomorphic, so that's about maybe about old religion. Only that the result. So we try to put those two types of images of God, and the correlation is only for anthropomorphic God, with non-anthropomorphic. They do not have any idea with the correlation with this God. Maybe because my respondents are Muslims and Christians. So if we see the chapter 2, I try to explain that for Christians and Muslims, God is so clear, personalized. There is a personalization in the Quran and the Bible, and so that sometimes it is not easy now for Muslims and Christians, at least what I understand now, to recognize the idea of non-anthropomorphic. But the result for in the regression analysis is also nothing. We cannot find anything. The prediction from the image of God, anthropomorphic God, to idea of generalized trust. Yeah, I agree with you. Maybe this remarkable situation and finding have to be elaborated to see more what happened with the idea of image of God. But image of Jesus and image of Muhammad, fortunately, still there. So we can still use this result as a theological research.
and the standard deviation from the non-anthropomorphic images are very high.
Yes. Yeah.
So
still,
there's possibility to look what this the background.
I do agree with you. This can be elaborated. I really do agree. I'm still thinking that maybe the scales, we have to make a big modification because sometimes how I measure with the sentence and also translation from English to Indonesia to Bahasa, then so the respondents sometimes do not understand. Maybe we have to see that more. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
After the defense, you have a lot of time, so you can elaborate on this.
I also
aspect
agree with that. Thank you.
For the next 10 years. I now give the floor to Dr. Castillo Covera.
candidate, dear Handi, I congratulate you on the completion of your PhD thesis. You have completed a comprehensive empirical research about the role of religion in building trust in Indonesia. And I like to continue with this discussion about image of God. And referring to Dave Kapukau, you affirm, let me quote from your book on page 45, image of God can be either anthropomorphic or non-anthropomorphic. I agree with your overview on different images that people use to express their experience and faith. But if in your research you maintain a separation between these two images of God, that brings me to suspect a kind of dichotomy in your approach, since you do not take into account another possibility. Let me explain this. Many people do not separate but combine anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic image of God. For instance, the Christology unifies divinity and humanity in the person of Jesus Christ. This means the union of the mystery with human history. Theologians as Rainer Moltmann of Leonardo Boff, authors you introduce in your book, also develop Christologies that unify anthropomorphic with non-anthropomorphic images of God. For instance, for Boff, God is mystery of communion, an icon for the human and societal relations. So, can you explain to us if your operationalization of the image of God does not mean a reduction of those that you on page 237 call folk theology of Christians? Is it possible to compare image of Islam in Christianity without excluding a third image that combine both anthropomorphic or non-anthropomorphic images?
Okay, Honored Sir, thank you very much for the questions and remarks. I have to say that I do agree that in reality we cannot make a very strict distinctions between one image and others. I have another research of this in my research about religious plurality, because Paul Nitter have 4 distinctions: replacement model, commonality model, and etc. But the result is also different. My respondents combine some types and with other types. So, for instance, the replacement and fulfillment models, they cannot recognize as 2 types, but only 1 type, and we call it as a monism model. Also, in images of God, I do agree with that, but we have to back to the methods actually, because in the quantitative methodology, we really need to measure one scale, and we have to make a really to be sure that one scale is different with other scales. We have to see that whether the respondents can recognize a distinction between one and others. But of course, from the factor analysis, for instance, sometimes we will get the combination between one image and other images. So the result of, for instance, anthropomorphic image of God that is recognized by my respondents, that's actually the combinations from the variants of images of God, not only anthropomorphic, but also there is idea of panentheism there, because panentheism is about relation between God and human, and then everything's in panentheism images stay together with the idea of anthropomorphic images. So I do agree with you that the images of God in reality is the combination. Maybe I can imagine that this kind of problems like you raise, if we compare with the methodology of qualitative methods, because in qualitative methods sometimes we don't make a very strict scales, because we really to see and hear and then make a codification after hear the informants tell or talk about. But yeah, this is the steps from the quantitative methods to make a scales, but we can accept the result if they combine. Also, the result of generalized trust, types of generalized trust, because socio-cultural trust, as I show in the beginning, that's also a combination, not only about political or social as separate types, but sometimes they put in combination, or sometimes they try to see with another way. For instance, for Christians, they have a type of fair salary system, because originally in the scales, that's economic from the economic domains, so the trust in economic domain. But in economic, there are two indicators, a fair salary system and a job opportunity. But for Christians, no, fair salary system is independent, but job opportunity, they put together with political domain. Because in my book, I explain that, I interpret that for Christians as a minority group, and also based on their experience, I believe, they see that the problem of job opportunity have a correlation with the idea of our government say something about opportunity for job.
So I just suggest to leave it like that.
Yeah.
And we continue to the next opponent, Professor Hadiwitanto.
Yeah. First of all, I also would like to join in the choir of congratulators. So congratulations with your wonderful book. But I'm here to raise a question, and this question refers to your ideal on public theology, or in your presentation you called it practical public theology. And you defined public theology, if I read this correctly, as a dialectic process between theological understanding and public discourse. And public discourse is described some pages earlier as a polyphonic voices of ordinary men and women expressing their experiences of acting and suffering in the historical reality of social life. Against the background of these definitions, I have a few questions referring to the role and function of public theology. First of all, public theology is a typically Western concept or typically Western type of theology. Its context of origin is the secularizing society. Meanwhile, some of the public theologians speak of a post-secular society, but nevertheless there still are secularizing elements in it. So the public discourse presupposed in public theology is thus a decisively secular discourse. My question is whether this concept can so easily be applied to the Indonesian society, especially what you answered, I think it was Paul Vermeer, you emphasized this religious background, this religious perspective, which is so important. So my question is, how can this concept be applied to the Indonesian society?
Understood, thank you. I also do agree that public theology is taken from the Western thoughts, and also there is a background of public theology which is secularization. I always talk with my students in Indonesia that secularization is also there in Indonesia, but maybe in different way if we compare with Western society. But the issue is when I put public theology in my reflection is not about the specific situation like secularization, but the main idea of public theology is about how we deal with the experience and about the public discourse. Then we need to see that that's very important when we are doing theology. That's what I think when I put the idea of public theology as a reflection, not as a name of a generalized trust, for instance, but to reflect this, because the result of my research shows that when people are doing theology and when they deal with the some issues, some important issues in public, then they can encourage the idea of trust. But if they do not want to see, do not want to hear, do not want to deal with the context, then trust is not will not be available. So why I put the idea of public theology? But maybe I also want to explain that in Asia, in Asian context, there are many theologians there. Let me mention names like Aloysius Pieris or Michael Amalado's liberation theology, like when Leonardo Boff mentioned, yeah, that's from Latin America, but also Amalados and Pieris from Sri Lanka. They always think that when we deal with the praxis, that's the idea of Aloysius Pieris, when religious believers deal with the praxis, not only about the idea of religious convictions about God without any correlation with the public situation. So if we deal with the praxis, then we can have a very good spirituality, and then try to build the community, the society. That's what I think from the public theology is still relevant, because when I see the idea of Aloysius Pieris deal with the praxis, that's, yeah, I cannot say that same, but in a certain sense that the idea of deal with praxis is a kind of public theology, but from the perspective of this result. So why we also put the word practical public theology, because we have to see that the public theology is not only doesn't belong only to Western society anymore. Now, this is the very relevant issue in Indonesia, in everywhere.
Jeb, am I allowed to raise an
Yes,
additional
you have
question?
2 minutes.
So,
2 minutes for the...
Your answer is very interesting, but this brings me to the following question. Who is the subject of public theology, in your opinion? So who does public theology? Because as you describe it, it is the people who are engaged in the praxis. But public theology still is a reflective discipline, is still a discipline, an academic endeavor. To me, it is not clear who is the subject of public theology. Yeah. Okay.
The answer can come later. The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my doctoral thesis to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors, as well as all those who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
The doctoral examination board retreats for its deliberation. the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen has decided to award you the degree of Doctor. I invite Professor Hermans to discharge the task assigned to him.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Council of Deans, I hereby confer you upon you, Handi Hadiwitanto, born in Bandung, the title of Doctor from the Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to the academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor and co-supervisor.
Please sit down.
Dear Dr. Hadiwitanto, dear Handi, congratulations with your doctoral degree at Radboud University. In Javanese shadow play, Wayang Kulut, the Gunungan, the tree of life, appears at important scene changes. It marks significant transitions and wants to stress the emotions related to the turn of events. The Gunungan symbolizes the beginning and the end of all things, but here today it specifically symbolizes the end of one stage and the beginning of something new. For sure, it is the most appropriate figure to designate this rite de passage, which is now herewith fulfilled. Also on behalf of Professor Hermans, I may address this laudation to bring to the floor some of the talents you used to successfully finish this project, to denote this rite of passage as a farewell that is, hopefully, only final in our capacity as supervisors, and to express the happiness about the awarding of your degree. Your happiness is our happiness here. Well, we may actually not all be happy for exactly the same reasons, but that is not necessary, because apparently happiness can take many forms, something we know already since Thomas Aquinas. Dear Handi, we met first back in 2001, when you were a master's student in theology at the Witwatersrand Christian University, specializing in pastoral theology. As is common in Indonesia, before starting your master's program, you had worked already several years as pastoral minister in the Gereja Kristen Indonesia, the Protestant church denomination that serves mainly the people of Chinese descent. Already as a master's student, you were standing out, and you seemed to be destined to educate your fellow ministers as well as other theology students. Several years later, you were appointed as junior lecturer at the Faculty of Theology in Jogja, and at the same time proposed to pursue a PhD here at Radboud University. Thanks to the generous support of the mission department of the Protestant Church in the Netherlands, the Congregation of the Brothers CMM of Tilburg, and the Faculty of Theology in Nijmegen, you were able to spend 3 months a year for 7 consecutive years in Nijmegen, working at your PhD. At the same time, you received slowly more responsibilities in Indonesia, in your church, as a lecturer in different BA and MA programs as Duta Wacana, but also in the administration and the financial management of the Faculty of Theology there. It took a lot of time and energy, and it explains for a big part why this project has taken longer than we initially had hoped for. For sure, not because of your lack of motivation. At the start of the project, your curriculum vitae gave already an idea of your thoroughness and your suitability for this project. And once the project took off, you were quickly able to confirm all initial impressions as a well-organized, a committed, and a concerned PhD candidate. One of the profits of this study is that you adapted theories and tools mainly developed in Western context to the Indonesian society, herewith also explicitly relating work of Western and Asian theologians. You quickly went deeply into the subject of the often complex intergroup relations in Indonesia, describing the economic, political, and social background of interreligious conflict in Ambon. This study resulted in a separate English publication in an edited volume and was not taken up in your dissertation. Your PhD work further has resulted in still 2 other English publications in internationally well-respected outlets, as well as 2 articles in Bahasa Indonesia based on your English text. At the start of the project, you summarized the main theories in literature and identified the main determinants for social capital. You then went on questioning what trust could mean specifically for your research setting. You selected some important religious convictions, both related to the core of Islamic Christianity, as well as convictions about relations with other religious traditions. And you argued for their relevance for intergroup trust, although according to some critiques, not elaborately enough. During the questionnaire development, you first systematically presented different available survey measurements, evaluated them for their applicability in an extensive tryout, and this was followed by a scale book, a code book, and the questionnaire itself. In this forest of empirical measurements, an approach which was new to you, you were able to keep the overview on the whole project and as well in the time-consuming analysis procedures. You did this stepwise and meticulously, not losing the broader aim out of sight. In addition to the testing and evaluation of previously validated measurements, you developed a theory and corresponding measurements for your dependent variable, the concept of trust, and this related to specific problematic issues in Indonesia. You further made a big effort in describing and operationalizing different models of the Prophet Muhammad with reference to the Quran, the Hadith, and Sunnah, an extraordinary achievement for a Christian theologian by education and for being socialized in the Christian tradition. At the end of your thesis, you once again reflect on the gains and the limitations of your study, zooming out again to see the bigger picture and to look at the relevance of it from the perspective of the public function of theology. You provoked some interesting discussions and the findings related to these topics wherever you reported on your research. That's for the content. But there is also the time-consuming data collection in a complex setting that I would like to bring under the attention of the audience here. Because you had to work in thorny conditions, the data gathering was far from self-evident. You started the preparation of your data collection at the moment the trauma of interreligious conflict, if not war, between Christians and Muslims in Ambon at the turn of the century was still much alive. Tensions were high, and the relations between Muslims and Christians were still overshadowed by these events. Just like in Wayang Kulit, it was not always easy to distinguish between reality and projection. The shadows live their own life. In the context of extreme distrust, introducing a study about trust felt something like looking at reality through a camera obscura, making relations difficult to understand and depicting reality ambiguously. Obscure. Let me give one significant example. In the beginning of 2007, we visited the research sites in Ambon as a preparation for your extensive survey that would follow a year later. Thanks to the network and the company of Professor Makassin, we had easy access to the Islamic State Institute in Ambon, later university. We were welcomed warmly and received acclaim for the study, promises for cooperation, and praise for the potential contribution to trust. It was only a few weeks later, with a visit to the offices of the International Crisis Group in Brussels, that became clear that shortly before our visit, plenty of ammunition, automatic fire weapons, and other heavy weaponry were found in the sports hall of the campus and confiscated. Talking more than a full week in Ambon about the past conflict, about ongoing tensions, and the way towards more trust in the company of well-informed and reliable companions, not a word about it. For the presence of the armory, until today, different interpretations are given. Was it a preparation for potential future conflicts between Muslims and Christians? Or was it a trap to disparage the rector aiming at his removal by rivaling Muslims because he was personally involved in the conflict few years before, maybe with blood on his hands? Whatever it may be, I only tell this anecdote to illustrate that you were able to solve problems of trust and many more in a responsible and careful way in sometimes explosive environments. To do that, you need, among other things, disarming manners, captivating personality, responsibility, flexibility, creativity, and appropriate apprehension. Allow us to applaud you for that, Handi. Your research and the context built through this research also paved the way for a wider research program sponsored by the Netherlands research organization NWO, which would focus on support for violence and contact avoidance in the same research settings as your study. During this work, you also had to overcome two more personal things, Handi: cultural restraints and also the borders of your own ethno-religious belonging. While the Javanese are not particularly known for their approachability and bluntness, you had to speak about the things that are not spoken about in a country where almost nothing is what it seems. At least, so it seems. You had to build trust in distrustful environments. Second, being ethnically Chinese Christian yourself, this is far from easy when you are potentially received as a party involved. With your reassuring sense of humor, you were able to overcome strong emotions and to cross boundaries of ethno-religious belonging. In public, I want to repeat now what I have said several times in conversations with colleagues. That is, that we supervisors saw you in a certain way as the embodiment of your research subject. That is, trustworthy. You know more than anybody else what this means. It implies honesty and truthfulness, and at the same time, predictability in line with the values the truster and the trustee share. Together with your talent to involve people and your talent for public speech, I can imagine this makes you an excellent teacher. Chris and I are therefore extremely happy and proud that you will continue your job as an assistant professor at the Faculty of Theology at Doctoral Christian University, a beautiful department with whom our faculty has excellent relations. We congratulate the UKDW with their new doctor. I know some of your colleagues follow this event through the digital live stream offered by the services of the Office of the University Register, or will otherwise look at the digital recording later. We greet you all warm-heartedly. Ever since the contacts initiated by Professor Wijse in our Department of Pastoral Theology, today acting rector, our faculty has developed interesting collaborative projects of which both institutions benefit and developed warm collegial friendships as well. We hope and are sure we can continue this cooperation in the future. Congratulations to the Gereja Kristen Indonesia, more specifically to the Tasikmalaya congregation where you function as an ex officio pastor, and to the Synod Council of the GKI. In this commendation, I also would like to include your wife, Christa, and your children, Aga and Bintang. Should be here somewhere as well, but he maybe ran away. And who are here for the first time in the Netherlands with you, together with your sister-in-law, Dida. Please extend our congratulations to your relatives and your friends in Jogja, Tasikmalaya, and Bandung. Greetings to you all from what is now Handi's alma mater, Radboud University. Dear Handi, also on behalf of Chris, we wish you all the best in your work, and personally, until we meet again, and we will, take care and live well.
Also, on behalf of the Council of Deans, I want to congratulate you with your doctorate and your book. And of course, I include your family in this congratulation, the family that came all the way from Indonesia to our beautiful country, though cold at the moment, the Netherlands. You are very welcome. As Dr. Sterkens already said, we have been collaborating with the Duta Wacana Christian University for many years, since 1992 already, and I hope that this collaboration continues, and your presence there is a guarantee that indeed we can collaborate in the future. During the discussion, there was one challenge to deal with, the images of God, but as was said already, you have plenty of time now to reconsider this issue and write more beautiful articles and maybe a next book about images of God in Indonesia. So once again, congratulations, and of course afterwards we have a reception and we can tell more and congratulate you even more. This ceremony is hereby concluded. I ask you to stand up and I will close with a short prayer. Gratias tibi agemus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.